Ocean Hills at its best is when we are in it together.
We are going to do an imaginative exercise, which if you were here the last 2 weeks, you were so shocked by. Oh no, no. We're going to pretend we're first century Jews on the side of the road when Jesus rides a colt into Jerusalem. I can't help it. This is totally my bias. I always have to do this. If we were first century peasants, which most people were, what would we think is going on here? So in other words, we're not Jesus' disciples. We're not followers. We're normal Jerusalem people. So I'm going to read the passage first, quickly, and then go back and we'll do our pretending. We'll develop our imaginations. So this is Luke 19, verse 28. After Jesus had said this, we need to pause right there. That's our first narrative clue that maybe we need to look back at the first part of chapter 19 because Jesus said something that we're supposed to know. And remember when we come to verse 28. So the first part of chapter 19 is about Zacchaeus. Someone tell us what's going on with Zacchaeus. Who's that guy?
Up in the tree.
He's up in the tree. Short. We all know that. It's that short guy.
Climbs trees.
He climbs trees because he's short. Right. Priscilla. He's a tax collector. And how do we feel about tax collectors if we're first century Jews? Worst of the worst. They were Roman colluders. They sympathized with the Romans because, of course, the Roman Empire is ruling over everybody. But the Romans used all of these mediating forces to help them control local people groups, which is so smart because it keeps things running a little smoother. So we would have tax collectors, some of whom were Jews, who would be collecting money from the populace down here. And the tax rate is crazy expensive. I think I said one of the first 2 weeks that I've heard percentages as high as 70% in terms of what was required. But tax collectors had ultimate authority, so they could collect as much as they wanted. There was no accountability. So they were known as extortioners because they could take whatever they wanted from you. It didn't matter if you couldn't feed your family the next day. Too bad for you. So this is how we feel about tax collectors, worst of the worst. And Jesus eats with him. Jesus. Always eating with the wrong people. Jesus is always eating with the wrong people. And what does it mean to eat with someone in the ancient world? That's my question.
That's who you have a relationship with.
Yep, you're treating them like a peer, like an equal. You're welcoming them into your group. And Jesus does the exact wrong thing here in the perspective of many people watching. Scholars call Zacchaeus the ultimate outcast, the ultimate marginalized person. He would have had money, definitely, but no friends except maybe other tax collectors. And they're the people that Jesus eats with too. When Zacchaeus hosts Jesus for a meal, he has his other tax collector friends over, and yeah, of course, because no one else will come. No other friends. That is his community, lonely community, you could say. But Jesus eats with him and includes him. What's interesting, though, is that Zacchaeus responds to him. Jesus doesn't say, oh, you're included, and there are no standards here, so you can keep extorting away. Zacchaeus has a major transformation in his life. And he gives crazy amounts back to people in terms of how he's extorted them. So that's a pretty amazing story. Narratively, though, by the time we get to Luke 19, we're not surprised by that. Because we've seen Jesus for the last, since chapter 4. So how many chapters is that, 15? 15 chapters, we've seen Jesus doing that kind of thing. Then we get this parable in verse 11. My heading in my Bible says the parable of the 10 minas. And this is a famous parable where, let's see. Verse 12 says, this is Jesus talking, a man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. Put this money to work, he said, until I come back. But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want that man to be our king. He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. What happens with the first one? The first one earns how much? How many more minas with his that he was given? 10. 10. And the second one earns how many more? 5. And the third one says, I didn't do anything with mine, so I was afraid of you because I know you're a hard man. And he gets it taken away. His master replies, verse 22, I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I'm a hard man, taking out what I did not put in and reaping what I did not sow? Why then didn't you put my money on deposit so that when I came back I could have collected it with interest?' Then he said to those standing by, 'Take his mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10. 'Sir,' they said, 'he already has 10. He replied, 'I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me.'" After this, after Jesus says this is the Palm Sunday text. And people have often said, "Well, this is uncomfortable. I don't know how I feel about it. Maybe I feel uncomfortable enough to just ignore the first half of the chapter or that part." Yeah, it's not very celebratory. Yay, Jesus. Oh, wait, kill them in front of me. Text. What's interesting is that many people have read this text as something that's about Jesus' second coming. So something that we haven't seen yet, in other words. What's interesting, though, is that narratively, in terms of how Luke is telling the story here, Luke sets up Jesus in the Palm Sunday text as Israel's returning king. As the king who returns, and for those who welcome him and embody his kingship and agree with it and get on board and participate, that's good for them. But for those who say no thanks, Jesus, there's judgment for them. So actually, we think that this parable is Jesus talking about himself in this moment where he's saying, "Hey, here I am. Here I am. I'm returning. I'm returning as king. I'm embodying this. And what have you guys been up to while you've been waiting for me? How faithful have you been? Have you been? Well, you've been waiting, or have you been sitting around in your butts doing nothing? Easier to do. So probably what we need to do is read this whole thing together and say, wow, that judgment piece might sound a little harsh, uncomfortable. Oh. But hold it there. Leave it in that moment of tension. Because if we throw that away, the judgment piece away, we lose some of the power of this passage. What happens when someone declares their kingship, their rulership? What happens to people who refuse that? Is that good for them? So we'll come back to that. Now we're going to do some celebratory stuff, though, because that was a little heavy start. So verse 28, after Jesus had said this dark judgment parable, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say, 'The Lord needs it.'" Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come on you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." Again, that note of judgment at the end. So we'll come to that. First, we get to pretend. We are peasants. This always helps me. We are peasants in the first century. And we're hanging out in Jerusalem. We live there. Life is hard, but whatever. But we don't know Jesus. We don't follow Jesus. We might have heard about him, though, because, of course, the rumor mill, in a tightly knit, communally kind of oriented people group, word gets around. So we would have heard about this Jesus guy maybe, but let's pretend for a second that we don't know him. We haven't experienced him. We haven't seen him do miracles. We are new. So we're going about our daily business, and some friends come and say, "Hey, that Jesus guy we were telling you about, he's coming. He's coming into town. You should come check him out." And we think, why not? We have nothing better to do than work to feed our family today. Of course, in this kind of society, though, these kinds of events where you don't go to like an 8 to 5 job. whatever job you have becomes sort of a day-long process for most people. So they would have, in that kind of practical way, had time to go check him out. So we go look at Jesus, and there he is. Well, this normal-looking guy, normal. Actually, I'm not super impressed. He looks Jewish. That's good. He is Jewish. He looks average. He looks peasantish. Maybe kind of up into the artisan class, people work with their hands, but that's this guy? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I feel about it. This is the guy who's creating all the news. That people are talking about this guy, and then he's riding in on a, not very impressive, donkey. Donkey Colt. Baby donkey. Baby donkey. We expected a horse or something much cooler or important for someone of his status. This guy? But then if we're Jews, which we are, yay for us, first century Jews, we might start to remember a passage, Zechariah 9:9, that we were talking about. This is an important passage in Second Temple Judaism. We talked about Second Temple Judaism the first week, and maybe last week, I can't remember. But this is the Judaism of Jesus' time. I mean, this is when the Second Temple was around. The first one had gotten destroyed by whom? Who destroyed the first one? Those Babylonians. Thank you. Back in 586, so hundreds of years before Jesus, and then a second one had been built, and it was still around in Jesus' day. It was being remodeled, my word, remodeled by Herod the Great. So it was being made pretty and beautiful. And Herod did a very good job. He was trying to win over the Jews. It partially worked. So in this time period, people are reading passages like Zechariah 9:9. It is so interesting then that this passage gets used here in Luke, because in other words, it would have been understandable to people. It would have been known. It would have had significance. And in Zechariah 9:9, in the Old Testament, this is what it says. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. This passage is in a larger section in Zechariah where God is promising to return to God's people, to give them a good king, and to restore them. And that way it probably sounds a lot like Isaiah, which we spent time on in the first week. This is a restoration kind of passage. This is what God is going to do when God shows up. Not in the sense that God was far away, see you later, God, but we're in the sense where God kind of proves God's presence and actively works to fix and restore. They were using this passage for that. And if this was in the air, and we see a guy riding into Jerusalem, is that the right city? If you're going to ride in on a colt of a donkey to any other city, will you make the same point? No way. Right city? Colt of a donkey. In other words, we're not stupid. Jesus, we're not stupid. We might have underestimated you at first. You didn't look super impressive, but now we see what you're doing at least. Strategic. As Max would say, strategery. Strategery. I see what you're doing. In other words, intentionality to embody this, to claim this for himself. And we would say, I see. Keep an eye on this guy. What's going to happen here? And the walking versus riding point, that's important too. Almost everyone walked in the first century world. It was practical, it was cheap. Only the very wealthy rode things. So someone like Paul, who traveled thousands of miles on his missionary journeys, he was on ships sometimes, but then he walked the rest of it, or almost the rest of it. Crazy. Good, strong leg muscles. So the fact that he's riding instead of walking, I mean, everyone else would have been walking. The only guy riding, in that way, he would have been very noticeable in terms of what he's doing. But then he's not riding the right thing. Was Jesus the first person ever to ride into a city on an animal? No. Was he the first person ever to ride in on a donkey colt? Maybe. That's the wrong one. In some places in the ancient world, they rode in on elephants. That's cool. Or some big, majestic, powerful-looking horse. Better than this. This guy, Colt the donkey? When I say, do we need to sit down with my smiley face, this is me saying, oh my word, if we were first century peasants, Jewish peasants watching this, you would think, oh my word. I see what he's claiming to embody here. He's intentionally enacting the Zechariah text. Oh. Yikes. I'm not sure how I feel about it because we had high hopes and this guy doesn't look super awesome and impressive. This guy? He's not even very tall. Shoot. The short guy. Not as short as Zacchaeus. The short guy. The poor guy. Of course, the Gospels in their different ways make it clear that Jesus comes from the right family line, the king line. But he hardly shows up in all of his royal glory and splendor. And we say, oh, I don't know how I feel about it. So if this is true, if Jesus is king, if that's what he's claiming for himself, to ride in on a colt into Jerusalem, a borrowed colt, not even his, that's worse. He doesn't even own this one. He had to borrow it from someone. And there's been a lot of talk about Jesus sending his disciples to just pick up a colt. This is random. Probably, we think, Jesus had set this up ahead of time. This is not his first time to Bethpage and Bethany. He'd been there when he was walking around traveling and speaking and doing miracles and stuff, so he probably arranged this ahead of time. More strategery, more intentionality. He knew this was coming. He knew he was leading up to it. And now it was time. Time for him to do it, to act it. So if that's true, what does that tell us about what his kingdom looks like? Well, kings in the ancient world and in our modern world, so some things never change. We like them if they have a lot of military power. Awesome. Makes us feel strong and mighty, big and strong and tough, right? Which our 4-year-old is obsessed with right now. Am I gonna be big and strong? Mommy, is this broccoli gonna help me grow big and strong? Yes. International context, we need someone who's connected, who can navigate this whole issue we have with the Romans. Yeah. Remember, this is a very Israelite, Jewish kind of thing. So to get kind of in their shoes a little bit and sense their struggles for national identity and what their Messiah was supposed to look like and be, and if he's their king, then how can this help them? A good modern equivalent to this, I mean, this isn't perfect, but how would you feel if Barack Obama drove himself up to, maybe not even the White House, an apartment building in a 92 Camry? Got out, waved, hey guys, what's up? And walked himself on in. Now some people initially might say, ooh, I like it. And after more thought, you might actually think, oh, I don't know. Doesn't really communicate what the presidential office should communicate, maybe. And some people right off the bat would say, don't like it. Get this guy a nice suit, jeans with holes in them? Really? Old car, really? What does that communicate about his presidency? Yuck. It's a little bit like that for them. Now going back to Luke 4, if we remember narratively, for those of us who were here the first week, this is where Jesus frames his kingdom vision. And so, in other words, narratively, we're not super surprised by this. In Luke 4, Jesus gets up in his hometown synagogue and announces what he's going to be up to, what his task is. And he reads from Isaiah. First, this is Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So even at the beginning, he does not say, I am here to be super awesome and bring military power. And have really awesome international context, too. He doesn't set us up that way. But still, for some, there's a sense of sort of, oh, bummer here at the end, especially for us because we're peasants and we're new to Jesus in this moment. And so we say, really? This guy? Now, some people might say, but Jesus is God, so Jesus really does have international context because God has control over everything. True. Is that what Jesus claims to be doing here, though, and using here? And if we're first century Jewish peasants, is our obvious category for Jesus God? We look at this guy, clearly he's God, obviously. Their obvious category for him would have been man, human. And the gospel writers and Jesus himself work really hard at arguing for the divine thing, because that is not an obvious claim to make. That's the crazy radical claim. So Jesus has told us his kingdom is good news for those on the fringes versus those in the center. I read someone today who said it looks like something like this. It looks like better news for those who have more to gain. A president who rolls up in a 92 Camry, probably rusted. In Minnesota, it would be terribly rusted. Maybe not so much here. I don't know. Looks like better news maybe for those who have more to gain. For those with more to lose, maybe not as much. And that's exactly what we see happen in this story. One minor point I just wanted to make too, in terms of this being good news for those on the fringes, and this is about including people and inviting people in, many people have appropriately said, what does this mean? No standards? In other words, everyone's welcome and just come as you are and stay as you are. We don't see anyone stay as they are after they've encountered Jesus in the Gospels. Sometimes it's explicit where Jesus says, change this, do this, leave this life of sin. Sometimes it's not that kind of commanding sort of way, though. It's like they encounter Jesus, they experience him, and they on their own, just leave stuff behind and make changes. And follow him and embody his values. And I actually like those stories more. He didn't have to tell them. It's like they experienced him and they said, well, this is clearly what I want to do and be. I'm in with this guy, with his mission and his vision for what God is doing in our world. I'm in. How do I join? What do I do? Throw this stuff away that's getting in my way. Hindrances. Oh, those are the better stories. So, Jesus comes in. People put their cloaks down. And Jesus' donkey, his colt, walks on them, verse 36. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. This verse, verse 38, the first part of it comes from a psalm in the Old Testament, a famous one. Are we shocked? A famous one, when they loved. Psalm 118. And Jewish pilgrims used it when they were heading back into Jerusalem on pilgrimages, and they used it to celebrate God's kingship. To celebrate their God, to remind themselves of who their God was and what God was going to do for God's people. Yay, this is a celebratory, God is returning to God's people, God is with God's people kind of song. So the fact that the disciples use it here about Jesus is very powerful theologically. In other words, this points very heavily towards Jesus' kind of, I don't know, bigger significance, I guess we would say, where the disciples realize it. Now remember, we're watching. We are not the disciples. It's really fun to pretend like you're a disciple when they're doing good things in the Gospels. Like, oh my word, this is totally me. Yep, got it. I would totally do that too. Except then when they make mistakes, it's easy to distance yourself from them and say, ooh, how did they miss that one? Weak. I don't know. I would have understood what Jesus was doing and done the right thing there. We don't get that option this time. We're watching. We're watching. This guy ride in on a donkey colt, but then his disciples, they say this about him, and we say, oh, well, someone's bought into it. We see what he's doing, and we see his disciples know what he's doing too. They understand what he's doing here, what he's claiming to be, who he's claiming to be, a king. We see it. But they are embracing it, responding to it. And what is so interesting about this, why Luke is the best one, the best gospel, is that Luke goes out of his way in his gospel. Ideally we would read the whole gospel all together and look at all the stories. Luke goes out of his way to show people from all social classes coming to Jesus. So Luke has a special kind of heart and passion for the marginalized, more so than the other Gospels. But it's like Luke doesn't want us to get a skewed vision either. The Gospel isn't only for the marginalized, only for the poor, only for the disenfranchised. Luke wants us to see people, high status people, people with a lot to lose in kind of a worldly sense, also joining the Jesus community, also following Jesus. And what that looks like is different for them. They have more to lose, more to sacrifice than someone who has nothing or almost nothing. But they come in too. At least sometimes they say yes to Jesus. They say no to Jesus too. But sometimes they say yes. So by this time in the narrative in chapter 19, we envision all of these disciples we've been learning about for the last 15 chapters. People of different statuses and classes, people of different genders. Luke mentions women way more than the other Gospels, and he names them, and some of these wealthy women supported Jesus' ministry, gave him the privilege of being able to go around and teach and spend time with people because women supported financially what he was doing. So in our minds, this is what we picture. Ooh, this group that Jesus has accumulated for 15 chapters along the way. A varied group. They're not from the same social class. They're diverse in that way, in the best way. And they've all bought into it. Here's the challenge in a passage like this. Is it easy to buy into it, like I said, when you have nothing to lose? Is it harder to buy into it, into what Jesus is doing here and claiming to be, when you have more to lose, when it might cost you something? Oh, fix my mic. Sorry. I'm not used to mics. Loud. That might help. Sorry. Now here's the bummer. Oh, that's much better. Louder. Now here's the bummer of this story. If you read Luke's gospel carefully, there are no palms. This is Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday text. Luke does not mention a palm. No palms in sight. His disciples say, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," but they're not waving the palms while they do it. Mark tells us that. So some people have said, "Oh my word, Luke is lying. Luke messed something up." And other people have said, Luke tells us he did his homework in Luke chapter 1. He tells us he investigated carefully from the beginning. And he tells us he wasn't the first one to write an account of Jesus. So what we think is going on here, most people, is that Luke knows exactly what he's doing. He's aware that palms were there, and he just chooses not to highlight that, which as an author you have the right to do. Can you mention everything there is to mention every time you tell a story? Or do you selectively pick things you want to highlight? Everyone does that. That's what history is. To write a complete history of this class tonight, it's not possible. For me to write down every single look each one of you has given me, to document that, to guess at your intentions. Oh, well, for a complete history, I'd have to know what your intentions were in giving me that look. So I have to interview all of you exhaustively. That sounds awesome, doesn't it? Who'd want to read that? So Luke is being selective here, and we think it's because he doesn't want us to get distracted. And the palms are distracting. I remember the Palm Sunday stuff as a kid, plastic palms, because in Minnesota, that's best in the winter. March is still winter in Minnesota, lots of snow in Minnesota right now. So that's all I really remember, to be honest. That was distracting. That's my whole memory. What else is going on in this passage? Jews in this time period use palms for something specific, and I say it up here. One of the big 3 Jewish festivals is this one called Festival of Tabernacles, or Booths. The big 3 are Passover, Pentecost, and this one, that Jews, at least loyal, kind of faithful Jews, were supposed to come to Jerusalem for, make a pilgrimage, and celebrate. And this one celebrates when Israel lived in the wilderness. So this one celebrates Israel's life when? When did they live in the wilderness? What had just happened that caused them to live in the wilderness, shall we say? Exodus. They're freed from slavery in Egypt. So this commemorates that time when they lived in booths or lived in tabernacles, in other words, temporary shelters. And they celebrated because this was a moment where God had delivered them and rescued them. So this was a good thing. Palms were part of that, kind of temporary plants that you could use. But Luke doesn't want us focusing on that. He wants us focusing on Jesus as King. So I like to call this Donkey Sunday, or Colt Sunday, or King Sunday. And my husband thinks we should call it Jackass Sunday. I love you, honey. So it's those kinds of things, though, that when you read the Gospels, if you can pay attention to them and notice them, there's so much power that comes with that. What is Luke doing here? He's saying, focus. A king whose kingdom is all about leveling out status distinctions. A king who rides up on a donkey colt. Jesus could have enacted a different passage from the Old Testament if he wanted to. There's some pretty glorious ones of David in all of his awesome power and might. Jesus could have enacted that or embodied that. Jesus chooses to do this one. It sends a very clear first century message about what his kingdom is looking like, what it's about. Leveling out status distinctions. I like doing this. It helps me so much. If you're more visual. Oh, there it is. And of course, for 15 chapters, that's exactly what Jesus has been doing, is treating everyone like they're this, instead of like they're this, which is how they actually were. He's been doing this. He's been living this for 15 chapters. Does everyone watching celebrate? Do we? Now, for us as peasants, this is pretty good news. Yay! We have so much to gain and hardly anything to lose. We have almost nothing we need to give up. We have nothing. Great! And we get included. Oh. Do the Pharisees, do they celebrate? Verse 39, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Rebuke them because they're saying, 'Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And Jesus says, "I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." Now, I don't want to be too hard on the Pharisees. It doesn't help to caricature them. What's interesting is that Pharisees would have been so hugely respected by us in the first century Jewish world. They were the ones who were so faithful to the law. Look at how good of a job they do. They're so exact. They follow all the details. They actually uphold this, and then they spent time teaching it and encouraging other people to do it also. They were such a respected group. We would have held them up here on a pedestal. The Gospels paint them differently, but they also expect us to know how people would have viewed them. So we see the contrast. In other words, they're more mixed. They're not just villains. It's easy for us to just villainize them, stupid Pharisees. But from a first century perspective, if we come in respecting them and then they get critiqued by Jesus, we say, whoa, that's messy. What do I do with this? They have more to lose. They have more power to lose. They have huge influence over the people. Most of them were what we would call middle class. They had a very small middle class. That's not even necessarily super helpful to talk about, but most of them weren't kind of low peasant class people. So they had more to lose. And they say, Jesus, rebuke your disciples. Do not let them say this about you. In other words, the Pharisees also know exactly what Jesus is claiming to be and do by riding in on a colt, a donkey colt. They get it too. In other words, none of us are stupid. We all know exactly what's going on, or at least we know what Jesus is claiming to be. We might disagree about what we think about that, but we know what Jesus is doing. The disciples, or the Pharisees do too, and they say, no. This guy, no. And Jesus says, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. Jesus claims his kingship affects all of creation. Scholars use language like cosmic dimensions to this. This is a big claim. The Pharisees are asking something of Jesus, pushing for something from Jesus, and he responds by saying, this is way bigger than you. Way bigger even than just kind of him. This is about everything. The stones will cry out. This is good news for all of creation. And this is such a good Jewish theme. I wish we had tons of time to talk about this. From a Jewish perspective, God is the creator of this world, and God loves this whole world. The rocks, the stones, the trees. God created this place, and it is good, and God cares about this place, and God is going to work to fix this place. Not just us. We're important, though. Humans are created as the pinnacle of creation, at the top, to be in relationship with God, but God created this whole place. God cares about all of it. The stones. This is good news for all of creation. Jesus as King is good news for everyone and everything, all encompassing. Oh, and Luke's gospel highlights that so much. Okay, half more of a slide, and then I have some discussion questions for you. What does Jesus say about the people who don't want to participate in his kingdom? If they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. And he's approaching Jerusalem, verse 41. He saw the city, and he wept over it, and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come on you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. He weeps over the city. They did not recognize the time of God's coming. And that's what he's claiming to be and do now in this moment, to come to them, to the city, in the way that only God can do. This is a huge claim. If his kingdom has cosmic dimensions, if his kingship is good news for all of creation, that's one of the things that from a Jewish perspective points toward the divinity piece. Only God can claim that. Who is this guy? Really? Your kingship is good news for the stones? And Jesus says you've missed it. And Jerusalem gets destroyed. This happens. Jesus talks so much about it in the Gospels. What year does that happen? Who knows? 70. Yep, AD, by the Romans. I've read people who say, can you imagine being alive still when that happens in AD 70? But you were alive when Jesus was there. So you've now been waiting 40 years for something to happen that Jesus said was going to happen, that Jerusalem was going to be judged for its response to Jesus, to be judged for the way it said no to Jesus. And 40 years later, you're still waiting. Can you imagine being someone, part of that minority Jesus community group who gets made fun of by other Jews? Ha ha, hey guys, how's that going with the temple destruction? And what Jesus said was going to happen, how's that working out for you? Ha ha ha. You think, shoot. Would you ever doubt, would you ever wonder if Jesus had been wrong about that? How could you not? And would you stay faithful? Or would you leave and walk away? And does that give us a good explanation for why Jesus gives so many warnings in the Gospels about not being disloyal, about not walking away? Because this is one of the things that Jesus said was going to happen, and it took 40 years for it to happen. And it's important to say that his tone is mournful. He's not saying, ha ha, you're going to get what's coming to you and you deserve it. He says, guys, come on, you missed it. He wants everyone to be part of it, but he doesn't force. He invites everyone, forces no one. So, and they oppose him, eventually help to kill him. Next week, we're going to talk about crucifixion and how it led up to it. And then we're going to talk about resurrection. And there it is. We need some good news, because this is kind of a bummer note here, but it's not the end of the story. So we have about 15 minutes, and I have 3 big discussion questions for you. I would like you to think, this is brainstorming, so no right or wrong answers, to think about how Ocean Hills attempts to embody the values of a king on a colt kingdom. If Jesus' kingdom is all about this, leveling out status distinctions, how does Ocean Hills attempt to do that? Now, to level them out means that we basically say that those aren't the biggest, truest reality. In the worldly system that we all also are a part of, is it true that people have different status distinctions? That is true, will always be true. But in the Jesus community, we say those aren't the truest realities. This is the truest reality. And then how might we do this better, or what could we attempt? I'm not asking for kind of church-wide initiatives, Lori, so I'm just saying like ideas for what we could do to embody that. And then what might participation in this kingdom cost you? So this, you don't have to talk on this one if you don't want to, but I'd like you to process it at least. What accomplishment or status marker is most significant for you? What would it look like for you to surrender the status that comes with it? I'm going to give you an example from my life. So I give education, job, house, city. I've been here for 7.5 months, and I'm getting a sense, a pretty good sense, that Santa Barbara has a lot of status attached to it. Ha ha ha, that's my joke, yes. So education is one for me. I have a PhD, and people in my field with PhDs are famous or infamous for being elitist and condescending and arrogant and rude and the whole ivory tower thing. And I've thought so much about what this means for me to be part of the Jesus community too. And what this has ended up looking like for me is for me insisting that I am not a titles person. And I don't insist that anyone call me by my title ever. And I've had people say, Holly, you've earned it. You deserve it. People should respect you. And I say, I think they can respect me without using my title. I hope so. And I think I can respect them. Why does respect have to be about titles? I refuse that. I think actually sometimes using titles gets in the way of that. So this becomes my sort of way to fight back against this system and to say, okay, in the worldly system eyes, do I have a PhD and I always will? Yes, I can't undo that. They can maybe take that away somehow, but I can't really undo that. That is a reality, but that's not the truest, biggest reality that sets me apart from other people and makes me better. So that's become a way where I've attempted to sort of work that out in my own life and try to embody that. So just as an example. And then if you have time, talk about the judgment piece a little bit. How does that affect you? What do you think about that? That's open-ended. You don't like it? It scares you? What do you do with that? So talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes, and then we'll come back for a couple minutes at the end.